And good morning, everyone. Chancellor at the University of Guyana, Professor Green, good morning to you. Jay Mandel, extremely fortunate to be joined by Professor Mandel again today. Thanks so much, Jay, for your continuing support. I will be extremely brief. A warm welcome from the United Nations in Guyana to this latest in a series of policy dialogues that we are hosting or co-hosting with the University of Guyana Green Institute. As Thomas said, this is on the triple planetary crisis, but the dialogues really come at a extremely exciting period of change for Guyana. We're particularly excited about today's presentation, given Guyana's advances with respect to its publication of the low carbon development strategy, with respect to its long-term commitment to rainforest protection in Guyana, and also understanding how some of these huge natural assets have potential to be monetized in a way, going beyond even the measures that Guyana has already taken. So for that reason, we're delighted to be joined by Daniella Suger. I will leave the kind of formal introduction to Thomas and other colleagues. Suffice to say, Daniella is a real life climate negotiator, and we don't always have many opportunities to meet people in such an important position, really, as we repeat the Conference of the Parties each year. So I will leave it there, but many thanks to Daniella for joining us, and really looking forward to today's presentation. And on behalf of the UN family here in Georgetown, thanks to all of you for joining and participating in this session. Participation so far has been fantastic, and we really appreciate the support that you're providing and the excellent questions that you've provided so far. Looking forward, and thanks again. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thomas, for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. I would like to thank the University of Guyana and United Nations Guyana for inviting me to this series of talks. It's an honor to be here, so thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody that's joining us this morning. I'm going to share my presentation today. Like Thomas said, we're going to be talking about carbon pricing and international carbon markets, and some of the considerations that we need to have when we're talking about these topics. So today we're going to go on a short trip together, and we're going to take a journey through this world of carbon pricing and this world of carbon markets. And I would like to show you the itinerary for our journey today. And throughout this morning, we're going to talk about these carbon pricing instruments and carbon markets. We're going to explore what they are, what they can do, and how they work. We will see that there are many different kinds of carbon pricing instruments, which include obviously carbon markets. And these are a way in which we're going to place a price on how much it costs to emit GHG gases, how much it costs to remove them, or how much it costs to reduce them. We are also going to see what the current state of carbon pricing instruments is and the carbon markets. And we're going to look at some national examples of carbon pricing instruments that have been implemented in Latin America. Finally, we're going to talk about the international carbon markets. We're going to take a closer look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which creates some mechanisms that parties can use to achieve their NDC goals. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the voluntary carbon market and some of the interlinkages that exist between Article 6 and the VCM, if there are any. So let's begin our journey. Before we start, I think that there is something that we need to keep in mind throughout the presentation today, and that is that the carbon pricing instruments that we're going to talk about and carbon markets are in essence mechanisms that can help us achieve climate change mitigation. And sometimes they result also in adaptation benefits, but in essence, what they look for is reducing and managing GHG emissions. So why is climate change mitigation so important? I think that with everything that's going on around the world today, we open the news, we see these extreme weather events, we see these extreme temperature situations. I think that often if we reflect, we have been witnessed or we have experienced ourselves the effects of climate change. So climate change mitigation is important because we need to reduce gases in order to align ourselves with the goal that we have established in the Paris Agreement. The last emissions gap report from last year analyzed the current climate goals that are established in the NDCs and other pledges, and it showed that we are still far from our goal, which is to avoid the temperature increase from 2 degrees, and better yet, before keeping the 1.5 degrees alive, in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That is our Paris Agreement goal. So the new mitigation pledges for 2030 have shown some progress, but we are still not there yet. We are not at the goal yet. So the emission gap remains large. Compared to previous unconditional NDCs, the new pledges for 2030 reduce a projected 7.5% of emissions by 2030, whereas we need 30% of emissions reduction to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius, and we need a 55% reduction to keep 1.5 alive. Global warming at the end of the century is estimated to be 2.7 degrees if all unconditional pledges are fully implemented, and 2.6 if conditional pledges are implemented. If the net zero emission pledges are additionally fully implemented, the estimate is lowered to 2.2, but we're still not at the goal. So it's important to keep this in mind because carbon markets and carbon pricing instruments can be tools to increase climate change mitigation ambition. So we're going to see how that works. And in addition, this report also mentions that 87% of the updated NDCs show or mention the intention of using the mechanisms that are created by Article 6. So there is interest from parties to explore the use of these mechanisms to achieve their climate goals. All countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement have presented their NDCs, and they have these mitigation goals that they need to achieve. But meeting these goals is going to obviously require different tools and mechanisms in order to achieve them. And the good thing is that there are a lot of different instruments that are available to parties should they choose to use them. Some of the different policies, instruments, and cooperative arrangements that we have are regulations and standards, taxes and charges, tradable permits, voluntary agreement, subsidies and incentives, information instruments, research and development, and other non-climate policies that can have an impact on mitigation or adaptation. The instruments that we're going to discuss this morning are examples of some of these policies. Which one of these is best? I cannot tell you. That depends, and it depends on each one of the countries, because each country is unique, and therefore the way that they are going to address climate change is going to be unique, because it's going to be tailored to their specific needs and to their specific priorities. So the idea of this morning is not to advocate for any specific carbon pricing instrument, but to show the different options that are available to countries for them to explore and then decide if they want to implement it at a national level. Even though these instruments and mechanisms are going to be implemented uniquely by the parties, there are some different criteria that policymakers can use to select and evaluate these policies. Some of the criteria are on the screen and are environmental effectiveness of the policy, its cost effectiveness, the distributional effects that it's going to have, and institutional feasibility. In addition, they may also consider the impact that it's going to have on competitiveness and the administrative feasibility of the policies that we are going to be implementing. So having established that broad context about what brings us here this morning, let's start talking about carbon pricing and carbon markets and explore what they are. The first thing that we need to know is that these carbon pricing instruments are instruments that seek to capture external costs of GHG emissions and link them to the source of where they are generating through a notion of a price. So what happens is that these external costs of climate change are not usually reflected in the price that we are paying for different services and goods that we are consuming. Some of these external costs include that the public is going to have to pay is the damages to crops, the loss and destruction of infrastructure, rising sea levels. We are seeing adverse health impacts caused by extreme heat waves. So there are a lot of different effects of climate change that we are going to be subject to. So these instruments capture those costs and link them to the source. And this price that they add to this source of pollution is going to be generally placed on the amount of GHG gases that we are producing. Another way that we can understand these pricing instruments is through the polluter pays principle. So we want to ensure that the impact that these gases are having in the atmosphere and in nature is being reflected in the activity and the transaction that we are conducting. So they seek to distribute the weight of this impact back to those who are responsible for those emissions and can therefore cut them at the source. So instead of determining who needs to reduce emissions, how and where, the price on carbon gives a signal to emitters and gives them the option of either transforming their activities to emit less gases and thus pay less, or to continue emitting but paying for the impact that those emissions are going to have. In addition, these mechanisms can be useful to achieve NDC goals, long-term emission development strategies, decarbonization strategies. They offer flexibility in the course of action that we're going to take, and they can help to promote innovation and development because we need to start creating new ways of doing things that are not necessarily linked to creating and generating GHG emissions. So wonderful. We've now determined what these pricing instruments are, but how exactly do they work? There are two general versions of how we can put a price on carbon. So there's the first one is we're going to limit the quantity of gases that we're going to generate. And the other one is we're going to place a price on the emissions that we're generating. Let's take a look at the quantity first. So here what the government does is that they establish a limit or a cap on the amount of emissions that can be generated in a specific sector or sectors of the economy. The companies and entities that are subject to this cap and want to generate GHG emissions through their activities must have a permit to do so. Or these, they are called as allowances or emissions permits. So they can either receive these permits from the government because they are freely allocated to them, or some of these schemes we're going to see that assign these units based on auctioning process. So me, if I'm subject to a cap, I can either receive these permits from the government, or I can go buy them through an auction. And then I can either sell or purchase these permits from other companies and entities that are subject to the same cap, depending on whether I used all of my permits or if I have a surplus of permits. So in essence, for every GHG emission, each ton of GHG emissions that I emit, I'm going to need a permit to do so. This creates a cap and trade market that is usually known as an emissions trading scheme. So here, the price of the permits is going to depend on the supply and demand of this of the amount of permits. So in this type of mechanism, we have certainty on the amount of emissions that are going to be generated because we have established that cap, but we have uncertainty on the price of each one of these emissions. So here, this element of uncertainty can make it a little bit challenging for companies to incorporate the price of this carbon within their business models. The other way that we have of putting a price on carbon is literally putting a price on the amount of emissions that are generated on fossil-based fuels. So this tax is, in essence, it's a tax that is it can be placed at different points of the fuel supply chain. It can be when the fuel is extracted from the ground, when it is imported into the country, or when the fuel is burned and it generates the emission. So the idea is that this price or this tax is going to increase the price of the fuel and therefore make it more costly to use it, and thus discourages its use. Here, in this type of pricing instrument, we're going to have certainty on the price because we are essentially placing a fixed amount of a fixed price, but we have uncertainty on the amount of emissions that are going to be reduced. The general idea is that emissions are going to decrease because companies and even individuals that are subject to paying this price will seek to find more economical ways of conducting their activities and phase out fossil fuels. So which type of carbon pricing instruments exist? We have two general categories of carbon pricing mechanisms. Some are implemented at a national level and apply only to national jurisdictions. And then we have international carbon pricing mechanisms. Let's take a look at some of the national carbon pricing mechanisms that we have. We have the emissions trading schemes that we just talked about, the carbon tax. We also have result-based climate finance, some compensation mechanisms, and we have hybrid mechanisms. So we're going to see later on in some of the examples that some hybrid mechanisms are not exactly an ETS or not exactly a carbon tax, but they sometimes mix elements of these types of mechanisms. And there are some hybrid mechanisms that are mandatory and some hybrid mechanisms that can be voluntary, and they can serve for different purposes depending on the design. So these national mechanisms are created and designed with a specific purpose in mind and to achieve specific goals that the country has defined. In addition, we have some carbon pricing mechanisms at an international level. And here we're going to talk about two different kinds. So we have those that are created under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have, and as we can just to remember, we used to have the first agreement that was the Kyoto Protocol, in which Annex 1 parties or developing countries needed to reduce their emissions. So they had set specific mitigation goals, and so they had to fulfill these goals, but throughout the protocol, they introduced different mechanisms that were available to parties if they wanted to use them to fulfill their goals. So we are going to look later on at the Kyoto mechanisms, but we had the clean development mechanism, we had joint implementation, and we also had some emissions trading schemes. Now, the compliance period of the Kyoto Protocol has ended. There has not been a renewable for a third compliance period, and we are now under the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, countries have set their own national goals in their NDCs, and the Paris Agreement also introduces flexibility mechanisms that are available to parties to achieve their goals. And these mechanisms are given by Article 6. So we're going to talk about three mechanisms that are created by Article 6, and we're going to see what they are further along in the presentation. In addition, we also have some mechanisms that are outside of the convention. And here we find the voluntary carbon market. We also have some result-based climate finance that is at an international level. And we also have other sectoral initiatives such as CORSIA, which is the offsetting scheme that was created by international aviation. Those emissions that are created by the aviation sector are not covered within the scope of the emissions of the NDCs. So something needed to be done about that. So ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, created this compensation scheme to compensate the emissions generated by aviation. So that's an example of another type of carbon pricing mechanisms that exist. The Maritime Organization is also having conversations to see if there is going to be a compensation scheme for maritime emissions as well. So let's take a look at what is going on with these carbon pricing instruments and with carbon markets. Before I continue with my presentation, I wanted to show you this image. This is a ton of carbon dioxide, basically. It's a ton of gas. Sometimes it's difficult for us to like picture it because we're talking about GHG emissions and it's difficult to grasp because it's something that we can't see. So the emissions go up to the atmosphere and we don't actually see them. So I think that this visual image is very useful, and this sphere represents a ton of a GHG gas. So you can see it's quite large, and all of these emissions are going up to the atmosphere. So keep this concept in mind. This is a ton of GHG gas. So now that we have established that, let's continue with our journey and take a look at some of the carbon pricing instruments that are around the world. This is a global map, and here we can see in pink the emissions trading schemes that are implemented or scheduled for implementation. In blue, dark blue, you're going to find the carbon tax, and in orange, you can see the countries that have both an ETS and a carbon tax. So you can see that there are different types of these carbon pricing instruments around the world. Currently, there are 68 carbon pricing mechanisms that are implemented, and 4 more are programmed for implementation. And these carbon pricing instruments that are in operation cover approximately 23% of global GHG emissions. Let's take a look at another graph. This one shows the coverage of absolute emissions, the percentage of emissions covered by each jurisdiction, and the prices of the carbon pricing instruments. So the size of the sphere is going to represent the coverage of absolute emissions. So here we can see in blue the carbon tax, and in pink we have the emissions trading schemes. And on the x-axis, we can see the percentage or the share of GHG emissions that are covered in the jurisdiction. And in the y-axis, you can see the price in dollars per each ton of gas in each of these schemes. So for example, and we're going to see it later on, we have Argentina and Colombia. These are some of the examples that I brought for you today. They have a carbon tax, and the price for the carbon tax in Colombia is close to $5 per ton. In the case of Argentina, it's a little higher. It's $10 per ton. So it's you can see there that the price is different. So here it's interesting to note that prices need to increase if we are going to align them in order to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, because the higher the price, the bigger the incentive or disincentive to achieve the mitigation actions. So currently, less than 4% of global emissions are covered by a direct carbon price that is within the range that we need by 2030 to achieve the Paris goals. According to the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, for 2020, this price should have been between $40 and $80 per ton of CO2, and between $50 and $100 per ton of CO2 by 2030, if this is going to be achieved. One of the most famous emission trading schemes, and one that has most experience, is the European Union ETS. And I checked yesterday, and the price per ton was at close to 66 euros per ton. So it's still within the range that we need, but we need to increase the price of these instruments. What has happened with the revenues that, how much revenue have these mechanisms created? Here we can see the income that they have generated. It has increased by almost 60% in the last year to close to $84 billion. Due to an increase in price and in a reduction from the free allocation of emissions permit, the income that was generated by emissions trading schemes was greater than the amount of revenue generated by carbon taxes for the first time. So that's interesting to note, because it tells us something about how these pricing mechanisms are evolving. Here we can see the distribution of specifically carbon markets. So in blue, you're going to have the international mechanisms. We're going to talk a little bit more about those, but those in essence are the ones that are created by the UNFCCC. So here we have UNFCCC. Then we have in purple the independent mechanisms that are basically the standards that we have in the voluntary carbon market. You can see some of the one that has the biggest carbon share is the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard. You can also see some of Gold Standard, the American Carbon Registry, and the Climate Action Reserve. And we have those created by some of the domestic mechanisms. So here we can see that there is a larger demand for offsets that have been generated in the voluntary carbon market. This is due to what happened with the international mechanism. Basically, the Clean Development Mechanism had a large amount of supply of credits, because there was a lot of credits in the market, but demand went down. So the price per ton in the CDM went down, and there was not an incentive to register more of these projects. So the international mechanism kind of was not in a big share of the amount of offsets that are being used. There is now, well, it's still to be determined, but some people speculate that the new rules of the regulated market, or the international mechanism created by Article 6, may provide clarity and in the future have greater growth of the amount of offsets that are used from these mechanisms. So let's take a look at some examples. Now that we know what is going on around the world, let's take a look at some examples of what is going on in Latin America. Through some of the examples, I'm going to explain a little bit more about these mechanisms, how they have been implemented by some countries, and some of the results that they have obtained. So here we see a map of Latin America, and we have some of the different carbon pricing instruments that we have. So we have the emissions trading schemes. Mexico is implementing an emission trading scheme. They are still, I think, in the piloting phase, but they have an emissions trading scheme. Colombia also has a mandate to create an emission trading scheme, so they are working on developing that. In addition, we have 4 countries that have a carbon tax: Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. And we're going to see that there are some of the carbon taxes that introduce a flexibility mechanism that allows for the compensation of the payment of the tax using carbon offsets. So I'm going to explain the case of Colombia so we have more clarity on how this flexibility mechanism works. In addition, we also have some projects of result-based finance. The red projects is an example, and there are different projects throughout Latin America. Brazil also has a national scheme of result-based finance that's called Florestas Más. If anybody wants to look it up, it's very interesting. And in addition, I have added this national voluntary GHG management program. So if you say carbon pricing, people traditionally think of emission trading schemes and carbon taxes, but these voluntary programs can also help to create a demand for carbon offsets. And we're going to see in an example from Costa Rica how they have done this. So let's start with analyzing an example of a carbon tax. So like we said a while ago, the carbon tax, what it does, it sets a price. So these are instruments that are able to adapt to a wide variety of national objectives and policies, and they can be useful in situations where emitters do not have enough incentives to reduce emissions. So Argentina has a carbon tax, and what they have done is that they placed a tax on liquid fuels and on carbon dioxide. And it applies to liquid and solid fuels, but not to natural gas. So what they did is that in order to moderate the impact of this tax and to not modify the fiscal burden that they had, to which the fossil fuels were subject to, they wanted this tax to have a neutral effect. Those fossil fuels that were not taxed before, like natural gas, coal, and liquefied petroleum gas, were exempt from the tax. So producers and importers of the fuels must pay the tax, as well as those companies that refine, produce, obtain, create liquid fuels. The law that gave life to this carbon tax also states where this revenue is going to be used. And on the screen, you can see the amount of revenue that this tax has created since its implementation in 2018. The law states that the revenue is going to be distributed differently. A part of it goes to the different provinces of Argentina. A part goes to National Housing Fund. Some goes to the National Treasury. Other is going to be invested in public transport or in hydro infrastructure or in social security. So they have determined which the exact percentage of the revenue it's going to go where. So in Argentina, those that are subject to pay the tax must pay the tax. But in Colombia, they also introduced a carbon tax, but they introduced what is called a compensation mechanism. So through this type of mechanism, we are often going to hear that this is a hybrid mechanism because it is not solely a carbon tax, but it allows a little flexibility on how the person responsible for paying the tax is going to pay it. So what they do is that they also have this national tax that was created through a reform to one of their laws. Their carbon tax, the reform took place in 2016, and it started on 2017, the application of the tax, with the objective of discouraging the use of fossil fuels. And what it did was it imposed the payment of a fee related to the carbon content of each of the fossil fuels when they are burnt. So the tax is levied at any of these three moments that are associated with the distribution chain of fossil fuel. So it can be levied when sold within the national territory, when the fuel produced is when the producer withdraws the fuel for their own consumption, or when the fuel is imported. So these are actions that are going to generate or create or cause this tax, which is only going to be caused once. Regarding that the generating effects that occurs first. So it can be when it is sold, when it is withdrawn, or when it is imported. And that leads to the causation of the tax, or for it to be collected. In addition, this tax was going to be paid within the fuel distribution chain as an additional value within the sale price of the hydrocarbon, and the wholesale distributor of the fuel pays this tax to the producer or the importer, who then acts as the tax collector and finally transfers it to the National Tax and Customs Directorate. The law that created this tax, as well as in the case of Argentina, also establishes what the revenue is going to be used for. So they have decided that 25% of the revenue is going to go to preserving ecosystems, another 5% to supporting the national protected areas, and 70% towards their peace agreement. The law, in addition to paying the tax, it also introduced what they call a non-causation mechanism, which allows those that are subject to pay the tax to avoid the payment of the tax by purchasing eligible carbon credits. So in order to pay this, to implement this mechanism, if I am responsible for paying this tax, I can either pay the tax or I can neutralize my emissions associated from the use of the fuel. The eligible credits need to have a 5-year vintage. When we say vintage, when talking about credits, is either when the year in which the credit was issued or the year in which the emission reduction or removal occurred. And the credits that I can use for this non-causation mechanism need to be generated in Colombia and come from an approved standard by the law. The carbon tax in Colombia, like I said, is close to $5 per ton. In addition, we have these emissions trading schemes, and here we have a diagram of what I was mentioning a while ago, that the companies that are within the sector where they are going to have a cap on emissions have this cap that we can see through this dotted line. So if the company is underneath this cap, they have a surplus of permits which they can sell to installations or institutions or entities that are above the cap. So you need this creates a market for these types of permits. An example of an emissions trading scheme in Mexico, it's Mexico, and they have a goal in their NDC to reduce their emissions by 22% by 2030, and a conditional goal of 36%. So they created these emission trading schemes to achieve their goals. And what they have done is that, well, they introduced this piloting phase, and then they were going to implement these emission trading schemes through a transitional phase, and then finally implemented by 2023. The sectors that are subject to this cap are companies from the energy and industry sectors, and only entities that produce or emit more than 100,000 tons of emissions per year. So that's in a nutshell how this is going to work, the emission trading scheme from Mexico. So we also have what I mentioned before, that are the voluntary national GHG management programs. These are basically programs where the government creates a voluntary program where companies, organizations, educational entities, communities, events organizers can measure their GHG emissions and then report, reduce, or compensate them. These GHG mechanisms, the voluntary mechanisms, usually provide these participating entities with the tools to conduct the measurement of GHG emissions, the tools to create the report that they have to present, And they usually provide these tools, the measurement tools, in either an Excel document that you can discharge, or an online platform that you can use to manage your GHG emissions. In addition, they also have a recognition system based on the activities that the entity has performed. So they have a seal, if the quality seal to the companies that have measured their emissions, a quality seal to those that have reduced them, and a quality seal to those that have neutralized them. An example of these voluntary GHG management programs is Costa Rica. Costa Rica has this program. You can see the different quality seals that they have. They have 5 different quality seals depending on the activities that are conducted. And in the carbon neutrality seal, they say which carbon offsets or which mechanisms companies can use to neutralize their emissions. So that creates a demand for carbon offsets. And it's interesting to know that since 2012, more than 200 organizations have participated in Costa Rica's program. In 2015, they had close to 8% of national emissions reported by participating entities. And they have also seen an investment between 2017 and 2019. The participating entities of this program invested over $14.9 million in their own reduction actions. So they invested in solar panels, in energy efficiency, in vehicles. So they have achieved significant carbon GHG emission reductions and GHG emission removals as well. Now let's go to the international carbon markets, and let's take a closer look at Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market. So how do these markets actually work? So here I have a very friendly diagram where we have a lot of drawings, and we're going to see at how this carbon market works. So basically what we're doing, and before I continue talking about carbon markets, I need to make an observation that even though we call it carbon markets, we are not only talking about carbon dioxide. Carbon markets also include other type of GHG gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and all the other fluor gases that can cause climate change. So we also include these gases within carbon markets. So we know that the activities that we conduct daily have an impact that we can measure in GHG gases. So the idea behind carbon markets is to place a price on how much it costs to emit these gases and how much it costs to reduce or avoid them. And the idea is that we are placing a price on carbon because it's what we are doing through this type of mechanism. We are placing a price on how much it costs to emit. So some of the mitigation activities that can be included within carbon markets are removals that have to do with nature-based solutions. So mangroves, forests, all these, even oceans now with blue carbon are removing GHG emissions from the atmosphere. So we have removals. Then we have emissions reductions that can be either related to nature-based solutions, where we are reducing the amount of emissions that are being generated, like perhaps we are avoiding deforestation, so we are reducing the amount of emissions that generates. Or we also have emissions reductions that can be produced through a technological solution. So we implement a cleaner production, energy efficiency, we introduce renewable energy. Those are ways in which we can reduce the amount of these emissions that we are creating. So here we can see that, like in regular markets, we have a demand side and a supply side. On the demand side, we're going to have companies, countries, individuals, events, sectors like aviation or the maritime sector, where we're going to have a need to reduce emissions. So these entities are creating GHG emissions and they need to reduce them. They need to reduce them either because they are forced to, because of a mandate that they were given, or because they have chosen to. So they voluntarily decide that they want to compensate their emissions. So that generates a need for carbon credits because we are going to use them to compensate or offset our emissions. On the supply side, we have these projects that are removing or reducing GHG gases. So they can create these carbon credits and then sell them to the people that need, or the entities that need to offset. So this creates a flow of financing towards actions that are going to reduce and remove GHG emissions from the atmosphere. So we have, and when you talk about carbon markets, you're going to hear these two terms a lot. You're going to hear about compliance market, and you're going to hear about the voluntary carbon market. Compliance markets arise from a mandatory commitment to manage GHG gases. Within compliance market, we can find the ETSs, where the government has placed a cap on the amount of gases that I can reduce, and therefore I am subject to complying with that. A tax can also be a compliance generator for the demand, because I am forced, or I am responsible to pay that tax. Or in the case of Colombia, like we saw, I can use carbon offsets to pay the tax instead of paying the tax. The Kyoto protocols were also a form of mandatory commitment. Countries had compulsory goals, mandatory goals that they had to fulfill. And now under the Paris Agreement, we also have goals that we need to achieve that are binding, that are the NDCs. In addition, also parallel to this, we also have some voluntary actions that can promote or create this demand for offsets. And these arise from voluntary commitments. Within these, we can find corporate social responsibility. We hear that some companies have net zero goals, or we hear about these carbon neutrality pledges or carbon neutrality declarations, or companies that need to measure their carbon footprint. So these are some of the voluntary actions that can generate demand for these types of credits. So this is how the markets are going to be structured. It can either be from a mandatory commitment or from a voluntary commitment that we have engaged in. So now let's take a look at how these offsets are creating, because I need us to understand the distinction between an emission trading schemes and a crediting mechanism that are the ways in which we are going to create these carbon offsets. So in a cap and trade system, the units that are going to be traded are the permits, in essence, are created by either this being under or over the cap that was set. So in this case, this amount of surplus is the amount of credits that are going to be generated and can therefore be sold, the permits that can be sold. So there is an incentive for the installation or the entity that is subject to the cap to be below the cap so that they can make a profit from the sale of those carbon units. But perhaps for other entities that are subject to the cap, it is more economical to, instead of reducing their emissions, to pay while they achieve the necessary reductions to be within the cap. In addition to emission trading schemes, we also have crediting mechanisms. These work a little differently. So here we see an example of a wastewater treatment plant, and we can see in the first, in the top part of the diagram, we have the business as usual scenario, where this wastewater plant is emitting carbon dioxide and methane. So this is the amount of emissions that they are going to emit in time if everything continues as they are doing. But they decide to introduce an emission reduction project. And what they're going to do, and we can see it here in the middle, is that they are going to capture that methane and they are going to burn it to generate electricity. Through the combustion process, we are transforming methane into carbon dioxide and water vapor. So that reduces the amount of emissions that are generating, because the carbon dioxide has a less global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So we are generating this emissions reduction. So this amount of reduction is the amount of credits that we are going to be able to generate. So what this company then does is that they can register this entire project and comply with established methodologies and register their project to generate carbon credits. So they can register it under a crediting mechanism. This crediting mechanism can either be from the voluntary carbon market, and in the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the standards that are in the voluntary carbon market, or they can be from the UNFCCC. Those are the crediting entities that are going to then issue the carbon credits that this company can then go and sell in the carbon market and use that revenue to either finance or pay back the investment that they made for the reduction project, or use that financing to conduct other activities. So here in this diagram, and it's appearing by parts, but we have the different markets that exist. So within the carbon markets, we have a separation. We're going to divide this carbon market universe into two. The market that's created under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the voluntary carbon market. The world of the carbon market of the UNFCCC is going to be then divided into two. We have the mechanisms that were created by Kyoto Protocol that I mentioned earlier. We had the CDM, the joint implementation, and the ETS that were mechanisms available to Annex 1 parties that wanted to use them to meet their Kyoto goals. Now we have the Paris Agreement, and under Article 6 is a flexibility mechanism that parties can use to achieve the goals that they have established in their NDCs. So Article 6 basically gives us three mechanisms. The one that's created by paragraph 2 of Article 6, which is talking about cooperative approaches. I will show you in a moment what they are. We also have a centralized crediting mechanism under the convention, which is the Article 6.4 mechanism, and it introduces a last mechanism that is not based on a market approach. So we have non-market approaches. I am also going to explain that mechanism. In addition to these mechanisms that were in essence created for the fulfillment of the goals that countries have under these international agreements, we have the voluntary carbon market. Some companies, entities have created commitments that are voluntary commitments. Here you have some of the commitments that you can find around. Some of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Carbon Neutral Now pledge. We have the Climate Pledge. So there are different drivers behind the demand for these offsets, because these are companies that have climate neutrality goals. So this created the need for a voluntary carbon market. And this voluntary carbon market is not governed by governments, but it is governed by private sector entities or private sector standards that are the ones that certify the projects and then emit the carbon credits. So we have different standards within the voluntary carbon market. Here you find the four that cover the largest percentage of the voluntary carbon market. So let's take a closer look at Article 6. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement gives us, in essence, three different mechanisms. We have Article 6.2 that's going to talk about cooperative approaches. We have Article 6.4 that is a centralized mechanism, and we have non-market approaches. I have a separate slide for each one, so we're going to look at each one separately. The first one is Article 6.2, which talks about cooperative approaches. And they tell us that parties can work together in a cooperative approach to create ITMOs. ITMOs are internationally transferred mitigation outcomes that they can use to achieve their NDCs. These ITMOs, which in essence are emissions reductions, can be measured either in tons of CO2 equivalent, which is what we measure the carbon units in carbon markets, or they can be measured in non-GHG metrics. This type of measurement of ITMOs was done because some parties have presented their NDCs and they are not in terms of GHG metrics. So they have presented other way of measuring their goals. So the idea was that they could also participate in these cooperative approaches. And what this tells us is that since both parties that are going to engage in a cooperative approach have a goal, they also have other commitments that they need to comply with under the Paris Agreement. They need to present their GHG reports and every other requirements under the enhanced transparency framework. We have a lot of MRV that we monitor, reporting, verification that we need to do. So there are a lot of processes that need to be accounted for. So the idea is that parties that engage in these types of mechanisms need to apply corresponding adjustments. Corresponding adjustments refers to that the accounting of GHG gases of each of the countries that participate in a cooperative approach are going to reflect that transaction. So we have one party that's going to sell mitigation outcomes, and we have one party that's going to buy mitigation outcomes. The idea is that that transaction needs to be reflected in the accounting of both parties. So one party is going to have to add that mitigation outcome to their national inventories because it is no longer, does no longer belongs to them, and another party is going to have to subtract that from their accounting because they're using it towards their goal. In addition to applying these corresponding adjustments, there are other requirements that parties need to have in order to participate in these cooperative approaches. They need to be a party of the Paris Agreement. They need to have an NDC and a lot of other requirements. They also have to present different reports and have registries to record and track the transaction of these units. These transactions are going to also be subject to obviously an expert review to see that everything that the parties are presenting is coherent and it makes sense. So we have an example because the text of the Paris Agreement was agreed to in 2015, and we didn't have the rules of Article 6 until last year in Glasgow. So during these years, while the parties agreed upon the rules, some parties decided to engage in Article 6.2 pilots in order to see how they work because we already had what they were basically. So an example is that we have Switzerland, and Switzerland wants to cut their emissions from companies, from cars, and from cows in half by 2030. And they want to have those emissions be zero by 2015. But they can only reduce their emissions by 37.5% in the next 10 years using the available technology. So they can achieve their goal by buying the resulting 2.5% from the market. So what they did is that they have an Article 6 pilot that through a bilateral agreement, Switzerland and Peru decided to engage in a project that was going to introduce improved cook stoves in Peru and reduce the emissions in Peru, and that those emissions reductions would then be sold to Switzerland and those would be used to their goal. So that's an example of how parties can engage in a cooperative approach to increase ambition and to also help finance mitigation action within other countries. In addition to the cooperative approaches, we have a centralized crediting mechanism, that's the Article 6.4 mechanism. This mechanism is, in essence, the new clean development mechanism, and it has a supervisory body, and basically what it creates is a new crediting mechanism where project developers that have been authorized by parties can engage in this type of certifying their projects or their activities and generating units that can be then sold. These units are going to be called Article 6.4 ERs. These activities are also subject to applying corresponding adjustments. Applying corresponding adjustments is interesting because parties need to be able to reflect that transaction in their accounting, and therefore all units that are going to be sold internationally need to have the authorization of the party to be sold, because the party needs to ensure that they are accounting for that unit that's going to be essentially exported from the country. So it's important to know that both the transactions from Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 need to have authorization from the host party that is going to sell these reductions. In addition, this mechanism also establishes different use of the proceeds. So we have what within the mechanism is called share of proceeds. So 5% of all the units that I generate, if I were to generate a project that is going to be registered under Article 6.4, 5% of the emissions that I am going to sell, I need to give towards share proceeds, which goes to the adaptation fund. And 2% of the emissions that I generate. So for example, say I have a wastewater treatment project that's going to generate a reduction of 100 tons of CO2. Two of those units are going to be canceled for OMGE, which is called overall mitigation in global emissions. So the problem sometimes with carbon markets is that it's a zero-sum transaction. So for example, somebody is emitting 1 ton of CO2 and somebody is reducing 1 ton of CO2. So if we add this and subtract it, we get 0. So it's in essence, we're not going below the amount of emissions that we are currently generating. And we saw in the emissions gap report that the amount of emissions that we're generating currently is not enough for us to reach the Paris goals. So we need to move beyond a net zero sum and contribute to mitigation. So the idea behind OMGE is that the 2% of those units that are being created are going to be canceled in favor of the atmosphere, so nobody's going to use them, and that's going to help us achieve that Paris goal faster. In addition, in the text that was agreed to in Glasgow, it tells us what activities and units can be moved from the CDM towards this new mechanism, because we are in a transition period now. We are moving from the world of the Kyoto Protocol to the world of the Paris Agreement and to Article 6. So some of the units can transition. Those units that were created from January 1st, 2013 can transition and be used towards the fulfillment of the first NDC. And some activities and projects from the CDM can also transition. In addition, we also have a non-market approach mechanism. Each of these non-market approaches are holistic approaches and that arise from cooperation between parties that seek to promote mitigation and adaptation, enhance access to financing, and a lot of other objectives that contribute to enhancing the implementation and fulfillment and ambition of the NDCs of parties. These non-market approaches are going to be registered in a centralized web-based platform. And we also have a governing body, that's the Glasgow Committee, that's following these non-market approaches. So we can see that this new world of Article 6, and in particular, the concept of corresponding adjustments, where we have to reflect these transactions in the national accounting systems, raise the questions of what is the relationship between Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market. So there is not a clear mandate that Article 6 is going to regulate the voluntary carbon market. So in essence, the text that was approved in Glasgow requires that all Article 6 emissions reductions apply corresponding adjustments, but it does not state that voluntary carbon markets are prohibited or that they need to apply it. There is not a direct correlation. However, there is an ongoing conversation about what is the link between these two, because the idea behind corresponding adjustments is that we are avoiding double counting and that we're ensuring that that unit is only going to be used for one purpose only. And so we are actually achieving the goal because we know exactly how many GHG emissions we have. So some of the conversation that is going around is if we should apply or not these corresponding adjustments to the voluntary carbon market. And some of the conversation is differently it depends on each country, because some countries have decided that they are going to apply corresponding adjustments to all of the credits, both from Article 6 and from the VCM. Others have decided that perhaps they are not going to apply it. So this is an ongoing conversation. In addition, this conversation is also going on not only within the parties of the convention, but also within the entities of the voluntary carbon market. So the standards are having this conversation about whether or not these units need to be correspondingly adjusted. And there are some initiatives have arisen, such as the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, that want to ensure that the quality of the credits that are being created in the voluntary carbon market is ensured. So it is therefore important to have this type of conversation within the host governments, because there are questions that governments need to address, how they are going to implement this within their national territories, and what measures they are going to take to avoid this double counting. So even though the host country perhaps does not want to apply does not want to apply these corresponding adjustments, perhaps the country that's going to buy, or where the buyer is located, needs to apply this corresponding adjustment. So these are some of the considerations that need to go on, but this is going to be a national decision, because there is not an official mandate to apply corresponding adjustments to the VCM. So that is some of the considerations that we need to have. And I would like to thank you. I think I went a little bit over time, but I thank you all for your attention, and I am looking forward to answering some of the questions that I can